Conscient Podcast, episode 172. Philosopher, artist, researcher, and scholar, Beth Carruthers.
What would change things was love. What would get people to act, to change, to make sacrifices, or what may be perceived as sacrifices and in the end turn out to be incredible things as we open up a world we didn't consider possible for ourselves. But it was always love that got people to take those steps and those decisions.
Born and raised in the occupied, unceded, sovereign territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples on the wild west coast of colonial Canada, Beth Carruthers is an artist and researcher whose work and practice focuses on how aesthetic engagements, and especially arts and design-based praxis, can seed and nurture transformative change in socio-cultural systems, leading towards a sustainably flourishing future for all life. My first conversation with Beth was in October 2019, episode 5. So I wanted to reconnect with Beth some 5 years later to get an update on what this amazing creative mind is up to now. She told me a lot of things, for example, about her origins.
I come from a family of Highland Scots who were driven off their land and shipped to Canada to be placeholders for empire. It's about 5 or 6 generations ago. So there is that. And the reason that's important is because for some reason for the Scots and Irish people and the Celtic people, they've managed, despite the church and all kinds of other occupations, have managed to hang on to a kind of animist understanding of being in the world.
At one point in our conversation, Beth referred to a poem, A Walk by Rainer Maria Rilke, from his uncollected poems. And this poem opens Beth's chapter in the book, Call and Response, Deep Aesthetics and the Call of the World. So Beth asked that it be mentioned in the episode notes, and I'll read it to you now. Already my gaze is on the hill, that sunlit one. Up ahead on the path I've scarcely started. In the same way, what we couldn't grasp grasps us, blazingly visible there in the distance, and changes us even if we don't reach it, into what we, scarcely sensing it, already are. A gesture signals, answering our gesture. But we feel only the opposing wind. Hey Beth, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Claude.
It's been like 5 years since we've had a Conscient podcast conversation. You were one of my first guests back in 2019, and we've known each other for a while. You're active as an artist back at the Canada Council. We funded some projects that you're involved in. Then 2006, I commissioned a research paper you did on art and ecology for a project here in Vancouver. And you've been writing and thinking, and we've dialogued. So I was really excited about sitting down with you and having a second conversation. So those who haven't listened to the first one, it was back in October of 2019 in my house in Ottawa, and we talked about a bunch of things that were on your mind. Welcome to Conscient, a podcast exploring how the arts contribute to environmental awareness and environmental action. My guest today is Beth Carruthers, who will introduce herself in just a second. But anyway, welcome, and maybe just introduce yourself, let people know who you are, what your background is, and then we'll jump into some questions.
Okay, I'll try to keep it brief.
We actually have lots of time.
Okay. So. I am Beth Carruthers, which we know, and I am currently an Associate Senior Research Fellow at Gray's School of Art at Robert Gordon University in Aberdeen, although we are not in Aberdeen, we are in Vancouver at this red hot minute. I also hold a graduate degree in philosophy, which is technically a degree in values and environment, and I'm saying this because it is in the work, which was from the Institute for Environment, Philosophy and Public Policy at Lancaster University in the UK, which was an institute bridging the philosophy department and the Centre for the Study of Environmental Change, which was a social and natural sciences research institute. So there you have that. What else? I think I want to say, and I want to say this too because it informs the work and this just sort of sets the baseline, is that I come from a family of Highland Scots who were driven off their land and shipped to Canada to be placeholders for empire. So about 5 or 6 generations ago. So there is that. And the reason that's important is because for some reason for the Scots and Irish people and the Celtic people, they've managed, despite the church and all kinds of other occupations, have managed to hang on to a kind of animist understanding of being in the world. I was raised very much in an understanding of the world as a living, sentient place, within which I had responsibilities and with which I engaged actively and expected it to be living and sentient. So that's not what school tells you, and that's not that's not the narrative of modernism in the West, that's for sure. But it's there. And I say that because I think it's really important to the work that I've done, which is what we're going to be talking about. And I think it also helped me feel connected here on the West Coast where I grew up, because there are strong resonances with the coastal First Nations understandings of being in the world. Well, you are an artist and a researcher, and maybe some opening thoughts on this notion of the end of the world as we know it, and as where we position that both philosophically and in terms of practicality, because this podcast explores the relationship between art and the ecological crisis. But more recently, I've been interested in what happens after the crises, what happens after the world as we know it. That's much of which has already disappeared. So, what are your thoughts? I have lots of thoughts, and I have to say first that I grew up that we were in an awareness that we were in an ecological crisis. And in fact, I would say that we've been in an ecological crisis since the Industrial Revolution, and the Romantics movement would concur. I mean, they really pushed back on that kind of thing, and you find that in the early writings, and it just kind of carried on as a sort of juggernaut. And now we see the end of the cul-de-sac ahead of us, and I think that's the difference. It's not that it hasn't been a crisis; it's just that we haven't been hitting a wall, or assuming we're hitting a wall. We see ourselves hitting a wall. I think what we're seeing is the end of the world as we know it, or as we think it is, which is not the end of the world necessarily, full stop. And that is the question. And I was just sort of saying, I was just listening to Dougald Hines' conversation with Dr. Ian McGilchrist, who's a neuroscientist, and you're familiar with his work. It's too complicated to sort of go into at this moment, but Dougald Hine is one of the co-founders of Dark Mountain. I think I mentioned him in the earlier podcast. And his new book is called, so I need to look at it. It's At Work in the Ruins, which is apropos of this, finding our place in the time of science, climate change, pandemics, and all the other emergencies, which are. And he mentioned in that conversation, an earlier conversation he had with cultural ecologist David Abram, observing that the end of the world as we know it is also the end of a way of knowing the world. And the thing about that is that it opens up possibilities. It reminds us that the world as we think we know it, is also a way of knowing the world. And it isn't the whole pie. It's a slice of the pie, but it's not the whole pie. And I think there are different ways of knowing, and so many more ways to know and understand our ways of being in the world. And I think, when I read your theme for this, I thought, oh, that's like the theme of my work, which it is. I mean, back in the 80s, I became very interested in thinking, well, what is it that the people we call artists and the practice we call art has? What is the role? What does it do? Because something that has been with us for as far back as we can look, and I think I'm repeating myself from the first conversation here, has high survival value, is important to navigating our way through the world and negotiating those relationships of our own kind, our own species, with all of the others and the world we find ourselves in. And so what is it? So I've been rather obsessed with understanding how it is, or the ways through which these practices work in human cultures. And I have this belief, and which I've tried to found this belief. You can still call it maybe unfounded, which is that one of the things I've explained it is to say, well, I think that artists and the arts can not only inform, but also form and transform human cultures and the kinds of relationships we have. And there have been all kinds of people over time that have made observations. Carl Jung said it was the role of the artist to address the unconscious needs of their time, and there are several other examples that are not at the forefront of my mind right now. But so the world as we know it, in thinking about, well, I think that's at the core of it. And what's concerned me about this is our understanding of what it is to be in the world. And that goes back to what I was saying about my own cultural traditions that have lingered, which I'll sort of call a relational ontology. Ontology is, in philosophy, about being itself. It addresses this question of being itself, what it is to be in the world. And so what we understand, the world as we know it, would be rooted in our ontology. And there have been a lot of people who have, in philosophy certainly, who have critiqued this. I mean, you've certainly heard this critique of, so-called Cartesian dualism and reductive ontology of modernity would be one way of putting it, which sort of shifts the world to the actual living world, not the world of ideation that we perceive in our minds. The world we set up for ourselves to understand and move through. That's the world we author. The ideation of the world is the world we author. But the world is not a mere ideation. The world is living and real, and we are enmeshed with it. And we mustn't start mistaking one for the other. I think the problem is that we do. When we start talking about things like Heidegger used to talk about humans being world-making or world-forming. Notions of making or authoring worlds are the kind of thinking that got us into this in the first place, right? Which is, oh, wait, the world is, there's all of this stuff out there that was just matter and mechanism that we can tinker with and use to our own ends no matter what, and we don't have to be accountable to it or for it in any sort of ethical or relational way. And we are somehow separate, despite the fact that we are clearly not at the same time. So the world is real, as a real place of powers and agencies, and we are, it's very messy, and we are messily enmeshed within it.
And art isn't innocent in the sense that it can reinforce that ideation, or it can challenge it, right?
Yes, I've been very interested, actually, in Ian McGilchrist's work. When I found it a few years ago, I was like, yay! Because I felt vindicated in a lot of the things that I had been thinking about around art and attending to the world, the question of attention, how we attend, and how we attend. Ian McGilchrist says this quite well, and I don't think I wrote it down here, and I wish I could, but if you go and look at the YouTube conversation between he and Dougald Hine, which is called "The World Is Not a Problem," which is a great conversation, then you will find out more. Artists and the arts. I'm still looking at this, and I love that it's so slippery, and I don't ever want to pin it down. You know, artists work with attention. They attend in particular ways. The process that is art, I think art is a verb, and it's a doing, and an engagement, and that process is not the same every time, because it's a call and response process, and it's a conversation process and a collaborative process with what is not only just other people, but with the world and all of these sensitivities. And artists, in a way, in a sense, are trained to listen to that somehow or other. You know, it's interesting as if not just, not reading art history or reading art criticism, but the practice of art making requires, in order for it to be meaningful and produce something that holds the voices of those conversations in any meaningful way, has to be that kind of engagement, I think. And I, you can call me wrong, and so what that means is, how do I explain this to you? I was talking to you about this the other day. I've sort of approached this in all of these different ways in my writing and thinking through it, and you cast a broad net that is very transdisciplinary, and so it all blends together. Daniel Conrad, filmmaker and geneticist, did a couple of films on aesthetics back in the 90s, and one of them is called "Seducing the Guard." And the title is taken from a conversation that he was having with John McLaughlin Gray. And it draws on Freud's statement that we all have a guard at the gate of the mind. And it is the guard at the gate of the mind's job to keep out what doesn't fit what I would call our ontological framing, the world, our framing, our understanding, our idea, or what we think we know, or the world as we know it, right? And if it doesn't fit, anything that doesn't fit can disrupt that carefully held and functioning thing, which has survival value for humans in cultures as we develop. Had a conversation with my daughter about this because she's a specialist in child development, but we won't go there right now. Anyway, what John McLaughlin Gray was saying, well, we have this guard at the gate of the mind, and he'll keep everything out that looks like it's subversive or disruptive, or if it doesn't fit the picture. But the guard can be seduced, or the guard can also be tricked. And the way he's a writer, so he was saying, well, what if you take a familiar form, and he uses the form of a sonnet, you can contain within a familiar form very subversive material. So it's like I think of it as a Trojan horse. It's kind of like a virus that you put into a system that kind of can kind of just carry on. And I also like to think of that as the way one of the ways, perhaps, that transformative change is seeded. And I sort of described this in a chapter that I wrote in 2020 for a Routledge book on art in the public realm. And I was talking about, I used as an example the Utsan Witness Project because it's great. It was ran for 10 years, so you could actually take a look at that and see. You couldn't trace a route from the seeding of a transformation to a final change, which is like what you see at the end. But you can see how that intention manifests in ways that don't always look like you thought they would, but you get there.
And I'll remind listeners that in episode 5 from 5 years ago, you talked quite a bit about the Witness Project, so they can listen back.
Sure.
You also talk about the gate. I was re-listening to it this morning, that the gatekeeping idea, Guardian. And it made me think about exactly what you just said, that there's things that we're keeping and we're protecting from that seem like threats, but actually might be the keys to our survival, right? If we find a way to curate or to filter or to allow at least to experience otherness in ways that isn't threatening, right? Because we're so scared. And it's ironic. We're scared of change, and yet if we don't change, we die. So philosophically, that's quite a dilemma.
Yeah. Resilience and adaptation are pretty important, And the thing is, if you've had it really good, it's that, no, change back. This is not really happening. Part of that is, or people are so confronted with things that seem so big and unmanageable, they sort of say, well, it doesn't matter anyway. I can just, we're all going to die, let's just have a party, or just carry on as we were. This is something else that I've been thinking about. And that's in very practical terms, it's like, I think I mentioned, and you mentioned about tracking impacts and outcomes of the work. And I think that's useful. At the time I was working, I mentioned with a whole lot of students who were in the hard sciences, and that's what they wanted. They wanted empiricism. And so I wanted to say, well, that exists as well. Here it is. This is your way into this stuff. But I think that we can get too carried away with putting things in boxes. And I think that transformation is slow. And I think I mentioned this too. I think Sacha Kagan also talks about this. And what you see at the end is change. And the change can look sudden at times or not. But transformation happens underground, like the roots. You put a seed down the roots of a plant, sort of get around, and then at the end you see change. And the thing that I'm concerned about now, in terms of what's actually going on, is this new industrial revolution. And that's the notion that we just need to change the materials we're doing things with, and we can just carry on the same way. In other words, we can continue to take the world apart for a growth-based economy. We'll just use different materials to do it. Let's everybody have an electronic car, an EV. But actually there aren't enough rare earth minerals to do that. Oh, let's mine the moon and let's, mine the deep ocean to do that. But we don't need those things, and so those kind of responses fit into the way we think we know the world, which is that it's a bunch of material that's there for us, and that our technology will solve everything because it's worked so well in the past. No. Right? So I'm very perturbed by that notion, but people take a lot of comfort in that. And I talked about this the first time too, which is the idea that climate change impacts are perturbations in larger systems. And there are other impacts, but that's the one that's been focused on in the media. And sure, climate change impacts are really real and a big deal, and yet we don't stop doing the things, taking apart the things that actually make the world habitable. If you cut down all the forests, if you keep allowing that to happen, then the climate can't be managed by the forests, by the global forest system. You run into problems with fresh water, and all manner of things happen, and forests are connected to the ocean as well. So there's a whole network there that we're not thinking about because we want to carry on as we have been, just changing the materials. And
the corporate powers are encouraging us to do that with the greenwashing, and those things are fairly well known now. There's lots of literature, and it hasn't sunk in for some people because they're in a kind of bubble of denial or a bubble of disempowerment. And
they don't know what to do instead, I think.
That's right. And including artists. And, my thinking is kind of evolving. I've been spending time with the Deep Adaptation Forum people, which is about acceptance. And there's different philosophies and ways of dealing with the anxiety and the grief. But when we last spoke in your house, maybe a year and a half ago, you talked about how there's a history of socially engaged art and art that leads to change. And you just said that it takes time, right?
Mm-hmm.
What I'm hoping is that all of this work that we're doing now, artists all around the world concerned about social justice and climate justice and doing work, doing real meaningful creations and engagements and embodiment practices and all that, I'm hoping that will come together. The dots will be connected, and that force will change things, and we'll all of a sudden feel differently about the world and we'll come out of this bubble of denial and bubble of disempowerment.
Or bubble of terror, which
bubble
is
of
not,
terror.
That freezes everything up.
So my question is, in the history of art, and you know a lot about it, has this happened before, and are you in any way hopeful that art can make a difference at this point?
Oh Lord, I'm no art historian, not at all. I'm kind of, I'm an artist, and I love the skilled making and doing and engaging in that, collaborative conversational process with the living world, and that's great. And I also made a long study in particular of ecological art, as you know. And when I was asking those questions that were saying, okay, well, what is this? I want to pay more attention to what this work is doing, and in 2000, I went to a conference at Lancaster called Between Nature, which brought together artists and philosophers and scientists and social scientists and people from all, in this amazing 4 days. And I discovered the field. I won't call it a field. What will I call it? I'll call it a field of ecological art, because it's not a genre as such. It's not defined by form. It's what defines it is an ethos and an activist commitment to transformative change in sociocultural systems. And the way that shows up is in an array of works. So what defines a work as ecological art is that. It's not just doing land-based restoration, or it's not just doing environmental theater or any of those things in particular. And it's not about media. It's about what the work is intended to do in the world. And when I looked at the work of the Harrisons, Newton passed away fairly recently. Helen passed away a couple of years earlier. They were pretty seminal artists. They, right after Rachel Carson's book came out, they decided that the only client that they would put first, and I think I talked about this, was the ecology of a place. That regardless, that in a commission they said that's what we're going to respond to here. So expect that, right? And the work that they did was really transdisciplinary in nature in Nicolescu's sense, is that it transgresses all disciplines. It isn't just a pairing of disciplines or a multidisciplinary thing. It's just a way of working that follows questions where they lead and comes up with responses by attending to the world and to a situation and a place. And the outcomes of that, there are a couple of projects that I talked about with, actually, I was teaching in the School of Environment last summer at Royal Roads University as well. So you get environmental management students, is what I had that time, and not so many hard scientists. But they needed to understand, I think, and see a way people need to see a way where this shows up, where the rubber meets the road, as it were, let's say, where things happen. And with the Harrisons' work, they did a very long project, which was huge, called Peninsula Europe, which looked at all the networked ecosystems of Europe. But a piece of that was one called the Green Heart of Holland. And Holland had this green space in the center of it that had been sort of preserved and was really crucial. And the Dutch government wanted to develop all of this housing. And so what the Harrisons did was they came up with a plan how you could preserve the Green Heart and also have housing, and that was connected to the Green Heart, and have people engage with that in a sort of very biocultural sense, which is one of my interests currently is bioculture, cultural. And the governments changed. They were like, oh, great. And then the new government came in and it got shelved. And then another government came in and said, yeah, great. And they took it off the shelf and they implemented it. And that's made a real difference, and it has preserved that space. Another one that they did was the Sava River, which feeds into the Danube in Europe. And they was to recover the river. And so to do that, they had to look at everything that was around the river and what flowed into the river from everywhere and where the river flowed. And there was a war, so they had to stop the project. And then they had an apprentice or a student that came on board with them who worked on it, and they actually completed it. And it made a difference all the way to where the rivers flowed into the Black Sea, to that estuary, to the health of the estuary, what they did with the Sava. So what they did was they look at the whole and they see the faces of the parts that are in the whole, but they're looking at the whole. And they're looking at it with a kind of attending to it, so listening to it, right? And they're listening to the people. And they open what they call a conversational space. And I'd say that use that in the broadest sense, perhaps. So that when they're responding to what the perceived needs of the river are, they use a poetic form a lot for text for their work. And it's the voice of the river, right? River, what would you like? And so there's this narrative that comes out at the end with this plan, this integrated plan for the river and the space. So that is restorative practice, but it's not just going in and saying, it's a very different kind of restorative practice. And one of the things it does is it restores the relationships of everybody along the bank with their river, just as the Green Heart of Holland project restored and foregrounded the relationships of people to place there.
I guess my point is we will want to remember these practices, not necessarily in their specificity, but maybe in their methodology. Not that these things are easy to do, right? Because they're many years of process and engagement and sophisticated. But I'm publishing an episode today with Felicia Young, who's a community engaged artist in New York City, who's been doing this for 30 years. Just community arts projects that restore spaces that involve civic participation, what we call community engaged arts or community arts. And
social practice in the UK.
Yeah, you can call it whatever you want. Judith Marcuse here in Vancouver, calls it arts for social change. So they're all more or less the same thing, but it's getting away from that sort of individual signature culture kind of, which is part of the arts, right? Because you want an individual to express themselves, and sometimes they create great things. But as I look into the future, I can see, and I literally can feel the crises that were going on, the disappearance, and I think artists will want to have resources to continue to be relevant. And I know that sounds a bit harsh, right? Because why would artists not be relevant? Well, in a world in crisis, c'est pas évident how artists will intervene. And this is projecting into the future. And I want to hear you about this because it's an emerging topic for me. I don't really know what I'm talking about yet, but I can feel that this is something we need to talk about and prepare for without panicking, that's why the history of art interests me. Like, when has it happened before? How has it happened before? How can it happen again? How is it happening now? All this. I know this is too much for...
Oh, I know this is more than one conversation, isn't it? Certainly. Well, it's interesting. If you recall back in 2000, at Inter 2000, which you put together at Concordia, and I sort of actually, without probably on the theme of going for forgiveness rather than permission, put together a panel. And I was talking about materials. And somebody in the room said, "You mean I should have to think about the materials I use?" And I said, "Well, I'm not telling you to think about them, but the materials are as much a part of the work and speak as much as anything else you're doing. They're not inert. They have a history, they have a story, they tell that story, and they carry that story forward in the work. So when you use certain materials, you're saying certain things as well. You're not just, they're not, as I said, inert, right? And I was really aware of that when I started going to the Vancouver School of Art at the age of 10. So I was really, and at that time we were using, I studied painting with a guy, in the when was that, in the 70s, who primed his canvases with lead white, still. He had gout, and that was probably why. But, when we dumped terps down the drain, and we used cadmiums, and we used all of these synthetic colors. And then you look at someone like Da Vinci, who was always experimenting with these things that you can use. So I think there are a couple of things. One is, what are you doing in the culture? I tend to have a problem, and I've always had a problem. Even as an artist, I've had a problem. I really believe that artists operate within cultures, within the world, which operate within a greater world. And as such, every artist is, in a sense, a social artist or a community engaged artist, because they are part, inescapably, of a community of life and of a sociocultural community, wherever they are. And I think that artists, if you take the notion that I have an artistic license or a carte blanche to use whatever it is I want to use, to say whatever it is I want to say, then I don't think that there is really a get-out-of-jail-free card. I think that's the same kind of thing we're talking about when we're talking about an ontology that sees the world as matter and mechanism that's there just for our use. And I think that just reinforces that, and that is a problem. I think that coming up with something you think is new that has a hell of a footprint, or does some damage, maybe requires a rethink. And I think the future for art looks to a past in the arts, like a really long ago past in the arts, where, artists were navigating and negotiating and discussing and explaining and, sort of acting as intermediaries between humankind and the natural world. And in a sense, I think that's a great role for artists, and not all of them will get on board with this, and I think this is a very contentious thing to say, probably, but in the sense that we all need to wake up and smell the forest burning. Mm-hmm. It's artists also don't get a get-out-of-jail-free card on this in any way. And I think it's about far more than emissions for your touring or what have you.
So that is a start, because then
it is a place to begin. It is a place to begin, because what it does is it changes the way people think about things, which is important, right? Or in how they pay attention to things, right? Oh, wait, what I do here, goes down, goes downstream, and it impacts so much more. And when a whole bunch of people do that, it's huge impact.
Well, next week in Montreal, I'm facilitating a panel from the choral communities of Canada. It's called Choral Canada, and it's a big conference called Podium, and we're talking about climate and choral music. And one of the challenges is they're going to talk about the artworks that they've commissioned and that they've performed, which are very touching and open people's awareness about environmental issues and social issues. And my question to them and to everyone is, what happens after that? Is that enough? Right? It might be, because art does what it does, but I think we're going to have an honest discussion about those who want to go, let's call it further, or into complexities. Yes, the art is there, but how can you further engage citizens into actions that are required, either through the art or as citizens who are artists? So these are questions, open-ended questions, that I think are interesting.
I think they are too. And I think, as I said, I've always known that art does something. One of the reasons that I love being an artist so much is because I love being part of that doing in the world and the becoming of the world, as a conscious becoming of the world. But I think there's a real danger. I see a lot of research as I look. I mean, I look back and I see from 2005 a report from David Curtis and a couple of other guys in Australia that wants to sort of put down, categorize the methods that artists use to do X, Y, and Z, and they test those and say, yes, they do this and this and this, and these are now methods that would be taken up and used. And then most recently, and I just read another report that was by a bunch of people from a bunch of disciplines saying, okay, here are these 9 ways that we can sort of evaluate for all of these things. We've evaluated the art, and I'm like, that is not what art is about. And the thing that I said, it's kind of like, it's slippery. And it's beautifully slippery because it's different every time, because it is that kind of conversational space, because that is that kind of engagement. And it is different every time. And it's not as if you're going to, yes, you can say these are the methods and we want to use them, but at the end of the day, you won't get the same kind of results as you will get if an artist is doing something and engaging in the world in a particular kind of way. And I think that that's the crux of it. It's so much more. It's got to do with, as I said earlier on, it's like art has to do with how we attend to the world, and how we attend to the world has everything to do with the world as we know it, or think we know it, the world, the ideated world that we create for ourselves. And that's something that artists have real power to shift. And I think that when people... And I did speak about this in the context of the visual arts, and you're sort of talking about choral work. And I wrote in 2003, I didn't get published till 2018 because it's an odd little paper, a paper called Returning the Radiant Gaze. And in that paper, I'm talking about vision and visual art works. And I quote Ron Burnett, who used to be president of Emily Carr University, and from his book, and when he sort of talks about images, is that no sooner seen than part of the seer. When you're seducing the guard, something comes in, right? If you want to put it in those terms, something can be seated there. So when you're talking about choral music, there's a difference between overt messaging that goes into the left brain and just kind of goes whatever, right? If you want something lasting, you have to get past all of that, past the chat, and you have to get to the deep. You have to go in the deep end, So I've been developing since about early 2000s something I called deep aesthetics as a way of talking about this and explaining this, and I'm still tussling with it and writing about it. Right now, I've been writing about it a lot and trying to sort of explain what I mean by that, because it's not aesthetics in the formal sense. It returns to the, we call the root of the aesthetic, which is to perceive with the senses. So it does that. It's a very deep way of learning in the world that we have from when we're still in utero to when we come into being. And art hooks into that. This is something I talked to my daughter about in terms of child development, and it still does. I mean, and I think that's one of the ways, I suspect that that's one of the ways and reasons artists can be so powerful, is because it hooks into that innate thing that we do in coming to know about and learn about the world and adapt to the world. And that's, for me, a kind of first principle that I'd like to get to, because I think that you can do triage and you can treat symptoms. Viva Ramani talks about environmental art as triage. And, but as long as the war goes on, you're always doing triage, So you want to get to the heart of it. And that is one thing I'm thinking about right now as the heart of it.
Well, that's a lot to digest.
Sorry.
No, I'm not blaming. I'm thanking you for putting some really interesting and clear ideas on the table, and more dots to connect. But in a way, there are fewer dots once they start getting connected. They start becoming units, and without being dogmatic, right? Because we always want to categorize things, and then people want to own it, and it's their career and all that. that power structure can be problematic, even though it generates knowledge. There's all these dilemmas that we need to work through, and there's too little time and all those issues. But what I find interesting is when we fall upon something natural, like artistic expression, like you just said, it's a part of who we are. It's in a way taking away barriers than it is creating, right? Because a lot of people are yearning to connect to nature, and for all kinds of reasons are not able. So how can we take things away, take burdens away from people so that they can live joyful lives without necessarily being in this mad world of consumption? And we can talk more about that, but I just appreciate the fact that you're bringing insights about not just the role of art as if it was a prescriptive thing. If you do this is a magic formula. It's not that simple. But it is simple in the sense that art is good for you. Not all art is good, but art is good for you. So we're going to wrap up soon, Beth, but is there more you'd like to say about that at this point?
I was just going to say that God, I was going to sort of say something about James Hillman when you were talking, and it's gone now. James Hillman he's passed now, a depth psychologist who did some really interesting writing on the aesthetic from this perspective as well, and the anima mundi, or the soul of the world, and he believes that it's the heart, and then he means the heart of being, the heart that is the heart, in a sense, the heart, the kind of soul, like thinking, feeling heart, that he believes that our love has left the world, and that we suffer because of it, and certainly the world suffers. And so the heart must be stirred. And when I first presented this idea of deep aesthetics at a conference back in 2007 or 2008 in the University of Oregon, I talked about Hillman, and I talked about that. And I think I ended with those words, like, let the heart be stirred. Because I think that's what that kind of deep engagement can do. And that isn't something that you can say, if I put a red here and a blue there, I'm going to get that. Because that's not bloody how it works, right, at all. It's not that way. When you are making or doing, engaging in what is art as an artist, when you are in that place where there's that kind of frisson between self and other, it's sort of like that space of attending and listening. In phenomenology, it's kind of called the phenomenological attitude, where you set aside, well, as much as possible, we all think we know the world in particular, all of our preconceived notions, and we just attend, so that what is out there shines forth for us in its own being, right? And I think that is something that the work that is produced can carry forward in its being, so that when, like a child going out into the world, it interacts with people in various ways, that is carried forward. That voice is carried forward as well. And I think there's something in that. This sounds all very esoteric. And yet, it's hard to find better explanations for what I see going on, or I haven't found any yet. And so I keep looking around for,
What I find useful is I listen to the Green Dreamer podcast and others, and once in a while somebody says something that resonates with me. And then I go, oh, yeah, that's in me, and you've just triggered it, or you just
right.
brought it. And I think I think what will have happened when people listen to you speak today, and other guests, because there's not that there's an absolute truth, but there's like a resonance. It's like, I feel that too. Let's listen to that again. Oh, now I understand. And then there's a link in the episode notes, or the person goes and watches a video, or they take time, they sit with an idea and they come back with it. But they're exploring, and they're feeling, it's not that they're feeling hopeful, they're feeling energized by possibility, and not this kind of, we're going to save the world and everything's going to be okay energy, but a different kind of energy that's hard to put your finger on, but I can feel it. I feel it when I listen to certain people, certain words, certain soundscapes. They just energize me, and there I am, being more productive than wallowing in you know, far too often.
This happens, I think, to all of us. The heart is stirred, Claude.
Right.
I talked about that as a call and response, you know, and I opened that paper, that chapter, with a quote from a Rilke poem that said, you know, it's called The Road or something. I wish I could remember it, and now my computer's gone to sleep, so I can't just read it to you. But it's a great poem. But basically, it's something to the effect that up in the distance, there's a tree and there's a gesture that signals, but we feel only the opposing wind. And that's got to do with whether we hear the call, whether we're touched by the call, whether it gets in, or whether we admit it exists, because whether it fits the framework of the world as we think we know it.
Which is how you began this conversation, talking about not just the end of the world, but how we think we know the world. And that's something worth thinking about, because there are other worlds out there that we can know and feel and live in, maybe in parallel universes. Anyway, I always end my conversations with recommended reading. You've already given us the Dugald Hine book, which I'll put in the episode notes, but are there other things you recommend our listeners read or see?
Well, I really do recommend Dugald Hine's book, and it's an easy read as well. And I recommend that conversation. If you can look it up, it's called The World Is Not a Problem. And if you go to Ian McGilchrist's YouTube channel, it's on there. You'll have to sort of troll back. It was it was last year he did that. The other thing is I do recommend Ian McGilchrist a lot right now, and that's because he's on my mind. And his work I've found tremendously helpful and as I said, vindicating and making it easier for me to do mine. I'm reading The Matter with Things, which is a 2-volume, 3,000-word kind of magnum opus, if you like, that is quite a bit heavy. But a way in is to read the smaller and earlier The Master and His Emissary, but The Matter with Things is, I think, quite wonderful text. I don't read a lot about art. You know, it's interesting. I do art. And I'm interested in what art does in the world, but I don't read art theory or art criticism at all. So I can't help you on that front.
It doesn't have to be that. It's what you're reading that excites you, or that is arresting you in a good way.
Yeah.
And you've given those examples, and you've given lots of hints throughout the conversation. I'll put those in the links.
I think that probably the most powerful force that we have is love. Back in the 1970s, I worked for Greenpeace in its original Vancouver office. And one of the things I noticed was that when you really wanted people to engage with something, nuclear disarmament, or you wanted the whales to stop being killed, or what have you, what was happening at the time was what information would never change anything. Even compelling, what would change things was love. What would get people to act, to change, to make sacrifices, or what may be perceived as sacrifices and in the end turn out to be incredible things as we open up a world we didn't consider possible for ourselves. But it was always love that got people to take those steps and those decisions.
Thank you very much, Beth Carruthers.
Thank you, Claude.